The soil was cold on the 4th of October, 1878. It was a dense, unforgiving cold that clung to the iron of the spade and traveled up the wooden handle into Ada Finch's bones. She worked with a slow and steady rhythm, a pace born of sorrow and necessity. Each lift and turn of the earth was a prayer her mouth could no longer form. Her husband, Thomas, had been buried in this same Dakota soil just 2 months prior, and now she was digging again, but this time it was a circle. A perfect, peculiar ditch, 2 feet wide and 3 feet deep, circumscribing the small cabin he had built for them with his own hands. In her pocket, her fingers found the smooth, flat stone he'd plucked from the creek bed on their first day here, its coolness a familiar anchor in the shifting landscape of her grief. She was carving a line between her world and the world outside. A person does not dig a trench around their home for no reason. Preacher Alistair Bowen was the first to stop. He reined in his horse, a man whose piety was as starched and clean as his collar. He looked at Ada, then at the growing moat of dark earth, his brow furrowed with a practiced concern that did not quite reach his eyes. "Mrs. Finch," he called out, his voice carrying the weight of public decency. "A word, if I may. Is all well?" "This is unusual labor for a woman in your position." Ada drove the spade into the ground and leaned on the handle, not bothering to wipe the sweat from her brow. She met his gaze. The muscles in her back and shoulders ached with a satisfying fire, a pain that was hers to own. "Preacher," she said, her voice even. "I am well enough." He dismounted, stepping carefully around a pile of excavated clay. "Grief takes many forms, my dear Ada. But idleness is the devil's workshop. Perhaps the Ladies' Aid Society could offer you some more suitable occupation. Mending, quilting. It is not right for you to be out here, toiling like this." She looked at the trench, then back at him. "The earth does not judge the hands that work it, preacher. I have my reasons." He could not see them, of course. He saw a widow touched by madness, a disruption to the tidy order of his town. He offered a prayer, laid a hand on her shoulder that she did not shrug off but simply endured, and left, shaking his head. Ada waited until the dust from his horse settled, then she picked up her spade and went back to work. Some things cannot be explained, they must be built. The talk started in whispers, then grew into open curiosity, and finally settled into a kind of gentle, pitying ridicule. It became a Sunday pastime for folks to walk the path past her cabin, just to look at what they called Raiders' Follies. Martha Gable, whose husband owned the mercantile, was the most vocal. She stood with a cluster of other women, her hands on her hips, her voice loud enough for Ada to hear from the bottom of the trench. "Lost her senses when she lost her man," Martha declared, a pronouncement that was met with solemn, nodding agreement. Digging a grave for the whole cabin, it seems Ada heard them. She felt their eyes on her back as she hauled buckets of rock and clay, her hands raw, her knuckles bleeding. For a moment, a sliver of doubt pierced her resolve. The work was brutal, and the loneliness was a constant, heavy cloak. Perhaps they were right. Perhaps the grief had finally unmoored her. But then she remembered her grandmother, a woman whose hands were as cracked and grooved as dried river mud. She remembered a story told not in a warm parlor, but in a root cellar during a blizzard, the scent of potatoes and damp earth all around them. Her grandmother had spoken of the old countries, and of the first houses on the prairie. "The sod dies. The earth is a blanket, child," she had said, her voice a low rumble. "It holds the summer's heat long after the sun has fled. You don't fight the winter. You go into the arms of the one thing that is older and stronger." That memory was the voice she chose to listen to. It was the only sermon she needed. Therefore, she ignored the laughter and the pity. She finished the first full circle around the cabin, a dark ring of commitment, and felt not madness, but a deep and quiet sense of purpose settling over her. She was not digging a grave. She was banking a fire. The work changed as she went deeper. The soft topsoil gave way to a dense layer of clay, and then to stone that fought the spade with a stubborn fury. Her progress slowed from feet per day to inches. The blisters on her hands broke, healed, and formed thick calluses. She was reshaping herself as she reshaped the land. Preacher Bowen returned, this time without the pretense of a chance encounter. He stood at the edge of the trench, his Bible held tight in his hand like a shield. "Ada, this has gone on long enough. The town is concerned. This is not the behavior of a grieving but godly woman. You are making a spectacle of yourself." It is an act of pride. She paused, resting her forehead against the cool wood of the spade handle, breathing in the scent of raw earth. Pride. She thought of Thomas, his face pale and still against the pillow. She thought of the empty chair by the fire. "Is it pride, preacher?" she asked, her voice low, to prepare for what is coming. He saw only defiance. "The Lord provides for the sparrow and the lily. Does he not provide for his faithful flock?" "Your faith is wanting, Mrs. Finch, and my faith is in God, preacher," she answered, looking up at him, her eyes clear. "But my grandmother taught me to bring in the harvest and stack the wood before the first snow. God provides the tree, but we must swing the axe," he left in a huff of righteous indignation, promising to pray for her soul. A few days later, Mr. Orrin passed by. He was a trapper and a widower himself, a man who lived a mile up the creek and spoke so rarely that most people had forgotten the sound of his voice. He stopped, not with judgment, but with a quiet, appraising gaze. He watched the clean, straight lines of her trench, the neat piles of soil. He observed the way she used her body's weight, not just her arms, to drive the spade. He said nothing at all. But the next morning, propped against her door, was a new spade head, its edge honed to a razor sharpness, gleaming with oil. There was no note. None was needed. By the first week of November, the trench was finished. It stood for feet deep, a clean-cut channel of earth surrounding her home. The final stage of the work was not digging, but filling. She spent days gathering dry prairie grass and fallen leaves, packing them into the bottom of the trench until they formed a thick, springy mattress. On top of this, she carefully laid a pavement of flat stones hauled from the creek, creating an air gap between the earth and the base of the cabin walls. She worked from memory, following the blueprint her grandmother's words had drawn in her mind. The earth was the blanket, the grass was the batting, and the stones were the final stitch. When she was done, she shoveled the dark soil back over the stones, tamping it down until the ground was nearly level again, leaving only a slight, raised berm around the foundation. To anyone passing by, it now looked as if she had simply created a long, low flower bed. The laughter in town changed from mockery of her labor to bewilderment at its result. "All that digging, for what?" Martha Gable scoffed at the mercantile. "To plant posies for the winter." The men who gathered around the stove wagered on how much firewood she had managed to stack. Not nearly enough, was the consensus. They looked at her small woodpile with knowing glances. They saw a foolish woman, alone and unprepared, chasing ghosts with a spade. They saw what they wanted to see. They did not see the wisdom buried in the ground. They did not feel the subtle shift in the air, the sharp, biting edge that promised a winter of uncommon cruelty. Ada felt it. She saw it in the way the geese flew south in a frantic, desperate hurry, and in the way the squirrels had stripped the pines of every last cone. She stacked her wood, sealed the cracks in her walls with clay and moss, and waited. The winter did not arrive. It attacked. It came down from the north not as a gentle snowfall, but as a solid wall of white, a blizzard that erased the world in an hour. The temperature plummeted. The wind screamed like a dying animal. For 3 days and 3 nights, the settlement was buried, each cabin an isolated island in a sea of churning snow. Inside the Gables' well-built home, the fire roared. John Gable fed it constantly, watching with growing alarm as the woodpile in the corner shrank. The floorboards, despite the thick wool rugs, were slick with a creeping frost that started at the walls and spread inward. Water left in a bucket by the hearth, a mere 6 feet from the flames, had frozen solid. Martha huddled with her children, wrapping them in every blanket they owned, her earlier confidence replaced by a gnawing, terrified chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. In Preacher Bowen's house, the cold was a moral failing. He prayed for deliverance, his words turning to smoke in the frigid air. He had preached of faith being a fortress, but the wind rattled his windows and the frost crept under his door, and his faith felt as thin and brittle as a pane of ice. Throughout the valley, the same story unfolded. Families burned through a month's worth of wood in 3 days, their cabins becoming tombs of cold. The confidence of the community, their certainty in their own preparedness, froze and cracked along with their water pitchers. They were pioneers, they were hardy folk, but this was a cold sent from a hungrier, older god. It was a cold that got into the bones of the houses themselves, a cold that the fiercest fire could not push back. It was a cold that judged. In Ada's cabin, the silence was broken only by the steady, gentle hiss of the fire. The logs burned slowly, evenly, casting a warm and steady light. The great beast of the wind clawed at the roof and walls, but inside, the air was still and calm. Ada sat in her rocker, a quilt over her lap, reading a book of poems Thomas had loved. She had placed her hand on the floorboards near the wall, the place where the cold should have been the sharpest. They were cool to the touch, but they were not frozen. There was no frost creeping across the floor. The earthen blanket her grandmother had told her about was holding the cabin in a firm, gentle embrace. The deep, residual warmth of the Dakota summer, stored in the soil, was insulated by the trench of grass and stone, a bulwark against the savage air. Her small woodpile remained mostly intact. Her water bucket held water, not ice. It was not a miracle. It was knowledge. It was the wisdom of women who had learned to listen to the earth, to work with it, not against it. Her victory was not loud or triumphant. It was as quiet as the falling snow. She ate her simple meal of dried beans and corn bread, the warmth of the food spreading through her. She felt no satisfaction in the town's comeuppance, no pleasure in their short-sightedness. She felt only a deep, quiet gratitude for the memory of an old woman's voice and the strength in her own 2 hands. The blizzard was not her enemy. It was simply a fact, like the turning of the seasons or the hardness of stone. And she had prepared for it. While the rest of the valley shivered in a prison of their own making, Ada Finch was safe. She was warm. She was home. The storm broke on the 4th morning. The wind died, leaving behind a world of profound and blinding silence, sculpted in snow. The sun rose on a landscape that was both beautiful and terrifying. For hours, nothing moved. Then, a small figure emerged from the Gables house, struggling through the deep drifts. It was their oldest boy, Benjamin, his face raw with cold. He made his way slowly, doggedly, toward the one cabin with a steady curl of smoke rising from its chimney. He knocked on Ada's door, his knuckles barely making a sound. When she opened it, he looked up at her, his eyes wide with a fear that made him look much younger than his 10 years. "Mrs. Finch," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Ma sent me. Our wood is gone." The baby, she's so cold. Ada looked past him, at the still, buried houses. She saw the thin, pathetic wisps of smoke rising from only 1 or 2 other chimneys. She looked at the boy, shivering in a coat that was not nearly thick enough. She could have closed the door. She could have kept her warmth, her foresight, her quiet victory for herself. They had laughed at her. They had called her mad. But looking at the boy's chapped face, she did not see the son of her tormentor. She saw a child who was cold. "Wait here," she said gently. She returned with a thick wool blanket and wrapped it around his shoulders. Then she took her axe, a small bundle of dry kindling, and 2 of her own precious logs. "Show me the way," she said. The road back to the community was a path she had to break herself, 1 step at a time through the heavy snow. The scene inside the Gables home was worse than she had imagined. Martha was huddled by a dead hearth, her infant daughter bundled in her arms, pale and listless. The air was thick with the bitter smell of frozen damp. The floor was a treacherous sheet of ice. John Gable sat slumped at the table, his head in his hands, a picture of defeated masculinity. He didn't even look up when Ada entered. Martha did. Her eyes, red-rimmed from crying and smoke, held a universe of shame and desperation. Ada wasted no time on words of blame or comfort. She went straight to the hearth, clearing the old ashes with a practiced hand. She built a new fire with the kindling she'd brought, nursing the small flame with skill and patience until it caught on one of her logs, its heat beginning to push back the oppressive cold. "Your wood is wet," she stated simply, pointing to the snow-dusted logs by the door. You need to bring it inside the day before you burn it. She showed Benjamin how to stack it near the hearth, but not too near. It was simple knowledge, but it was the kind of knowledge that made the difference between life and death. Just as the warmth began to fill the room, the door opened again. It was Preacher Bowen. He took in the scene, the reviving fire, the shivering family, and Ada Finch, her face smudged with soot, quietly giving instructions. He looked at the ice on the floor of the mercantile owner's house, and the truth of his own foolishness hit him with the force of a physical blow. He had preached faith, but she had practiced it. He walked toward her, his boots crunching on the frozen floor. He stopped, his gaze falling to the simple, competent work of her hands. "Mrs. Finch," he began, his voice thick. He cleared his throat. "We were wrong." He could not bring himself to say more, but those 3 words were a sermon in themselves. Ada looked up from the fire, her expression unreadable. "The coal does not care who is right, preacher," she said, her voice soft but clear. "It only cares who is prepared." That spring, after the great thaw, a different kind of visitor came to Ada's cabin. First 1, then 2, then a small group of the town's men, John Gable among them. They did not come with pity or mockery. They came with hats in their hands and a deep, abiding humility in their eyes. They stood by the faint outline of her trench, now covered in the first green shoots of spring grass. They looked at her cabin, then at their own, seeing them in a new light. It was John Gable who spoke first. "Mrs. Finch," he said, avoiding her eyes. We were wondering if you might show us what you did." Ada looked at their faces, at the hard-won lesson of the winter etched upon them. She saw her neighbor, Mr. Orrin, leaning against a fence post a short distance away, watching the exchange with a quiet, knowing look. He gave her a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Ada went into her cabin and returned with the spade Thomas had used, its handle worn smooth by his hands. She did not give them a lecture. She did not remind them of their laughter. She simply walked to the edge of the trench and drove the spade into the soft spring earth. "You start here," she said. "The earth holds the heat. You have to give it a place to rest against the walls. A blanket of grass, a layer of stone for air, and then the earth itself." She showed them how to measure, how to angle the cut, how to listen to what the soil told them. They watched, they learned, and then, one by one, they went to fetch their own tools. The sound of shovels scraping against stone became the new sound of the valley, a sound of repentance and rebirth. They were rebuilding their community, not with sermons or apologies, but with shared labor, guided by the quiet wisdom of the woman they had once called mad. Years passed. The trench around Ada Finch's cabin became a permanent feature of the landscape. She lined its inner walls with stone, and in the raised berm of earth, she planted thyme and winter savory, herbs that thrived in the protected ground. Nearly every cabin in the valley now had a similar, if less elegant, earthwork around its foundation. They called them Finch walls now, the name spoken not with ridicule, but with a deep and lasting respect. Ada grew older, her hair turning the color of winter frost, her hands gnarled but still strong. She was no longer just the widow, the outsider. She was the woman who had listened to the earth. On a cold November night, with the first snow dusting the ground outside, she sat by her fire, the flames burning low and steady, just as they always had. She reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out the smooth, flat river stone Thomas had given her so long ago. Its surface was cool, a perfect, solid piece of the world. She held it in her palm, its weight a familiar comfort. Outside, the stars were sharp and brilliant in the cold, clear air. She looked out at the quiet valley, at the houses tucked into their earthen blankets, their chimneys breathing gentle plumes of smoke into the night. She had not set out to teach anyone a lesson. She had only meant to survive. But the earth keeps its promises, and it remembers the hands that treat it with respect. It offers its warmth not to the proud or the pious, but to the patient, to those who are willing to do the work. The stone in her hand was a testament. The warmth in her home was the proof.